When I was growing up, there was a song that had a little run as a very well-known tune in the 70s, maybe into the 80s. I don't know who wrote it, but it was made popular by Barry Manilow. It's just another New Year's Eve. Don't look so sad. It's not so bad, you know, it's just another night. It's all it is. It's not the first, it's not the worst, and so on. It's just another New Year's Eve, another night like all the rest. I really hope that is true, and in many ways it is. We tell ourselves it's the new year and everything starts over December 31st to January 1st. But New Year's Day is arbitrary. New Year can start at any time. We just happen to be using this one now, December 31st to January 1st. The astronomical New Year is the spring equinox. The Christian New Year is the first Sunday of Advent, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas. The pagan New Year is Samhain, or Halloween. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the 1st and 2nd of Tishrei, on our calendar is usually in September, usually in the first half. Chinese New Year, following a lunar calendar, moves around, and this year is January 29th. The first day of the Muslim New Year is the 1st of Muharram, which this year is July 25th. New Year's Day is arbitrary. It only has meaning in the context of the calendar you're using and the reason you're using that calendar and the story you attach to it. All those New Years I just named have their own story in their own context in which that New Year makes sense. Whatever night is New Year's Eve is important in your story and your calendar and your culture and your context. But in a larger reality, to so many other people, is just another night like all the rest. The story we attach to things not only gives meaning and context to our lives, because we are creatures that look for and see and create patterns and symbols and stories, but in so doing, helps explain ourselves to ourselves. It's the instruction book. Where we come from, where we're going, who we ought to be on the journey. Religion is one such story. Religion is a story people who follow the religion tell themselves about who they are, where they come from, where they're going, and how they ought to live on the journey. A religion story is often made manifest and comes to life in its rituals and ceremonies. Religion becomes a community that tells and lives and shares that story. During my studies at Harvard Divinity School, I was very fortunate to be able to study with a visiting professor, Inez Talamantes, who was visiting as a professor from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And Professor Talamantes was a Mescalero Apache woman. And she was teaching, wait for it, a course on Native American spiritual traditions. And she told us something that hit me very profoundly on the first day of class. She said, there is no such thing as Native American religion, or Apache religion, or spirituality. There is only being an Apache, or a Diné, or Lakota, or Wampanoag, and she listed a whole bunch of other tribes I can't remember the name of. And she said, because I'm an Apache, I know the Apache way of life. I know that this way of life includes the story of my people, which I can tell to you. It contains our accumulated Apache wisdom, our ethics, our medicine, our rituals. Things that are usually associated with religion in many contexts. But this is not my Apache religion. This is my life as an Apache. She taught us about the coming of age ritual for Mescalero Apache girls. 4 days long. And the initiates never stopped dancing. Those of you who grew up and faced other religious ceremonies and traditions that you had to do, I bet it wasn't 4 days long. And it's fascinating because in its entirety, the 4-day ceremony tells the Apache story. From the creation to the beginning of the people to the 4 stages of life. And through the ceremony of the 4 days, the initiates, the girls becoming women, they go through all the 4 stages of life ceremonially. And they dress as white changing women, the divine figure who shepherds the people through their life stages. They paint their faces with white clay paint and wear white clothes with many beads. And in the last day, as they complete a run, they run these laps around certain piles of gifts and different things. While they're running the last time after 4 days of dancing and not eating and only drinking water, they wipe the white paint off their face and they are women. This probably doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to us. But to an Apache, they will see their own story in it. They will see the story of the Apache people. They will be connected to it and to each other in ways so profound we as people who are not Apache could never understand completely, even though we might understand the words or the dances or the symbols or the ritual. As Professor Talamantes said, there is no Apache religion. There is only being an Apache. Every year in the celebration of Passover, Jews have a meal at home with family and friends and tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The birth of Moses, the burning bush, the rise of Moses as a prophet, the 10 plagues visited upon Pharaoh who won't let the enslaved people go. And it tells the people who are celebrating their story and how they connect to it. It brings the story up to the giving of all the commandments on Mount Sinai, which is celebrated a month later at Shavuot, the next major holiday. The Christian story is based on Easter, the Easter event in the Christian scriptures where Jesus eats a last meal with his followers. He's arrested, he's crucified by the Romans, and so their story goes, was raised from the dead 3 days later. So every Sunday, many Christian denominations tell this story again. They reenact the Last Supper with their communion ritual, and they tell that story over and over. My wife's church, Episcopal Church, like Catholic churches, Lutheran, some others, on Easter itself, they tell the whole story. They read many readings from the scriptures, starting with the creation story in the Bible, and they tell the stories of the matriarchs and patriarchs, and then the Exodus story, and stories throughout the history and the prophets, and the Jesus story, and they bring it all the way up. They call this in Christianity salvation history. Does it co-opt the Jewish story? Yes, but that's for another sermon. But that's their story as they see it, and they tell the whole thing on the Easter Vigil. Even religion that isn't religion, even people who have no religion, have a story. Science has a story. Carl Sagan told science's story in Cosmos, popularized science. If you've ever studied quantum mechanics at all, you will find stuff as mystical as any religious text you've ever read. Because it actually, literally, physically is possible for particles to be everywhere in the universe at the same time. This is the reality we actually live in. If that doesn't blow your mind, nothing will. Reverend Michael Dowd, who passed away 2 years ago now, and his partner Connie Barlow became very well known in Unitarian Universalist circles about a decade ago, 15 years ago, as evangelists for what they called the Great Story, which, as their website puts it, Humanity's common creation story, the 14 billion year science-based sacred story of cosmic genesis, from the formation of galaxies and the origin of life on Earth to the development of self-reflective consciousness and collective learning, to the emergence of comprehensive compassion and tools to assist humanity in living harmoniously with the larger body of life in the entirety of the cosmos. There's a story. All right, that's a story. They gave presentations at our UU General Assembly, our annual yearly convention. They wrote religious education curriculum for adults and for young people that included sacred sites, parables, tales, and activities about all these different developments in the evolution of the cosmos and of human beings. And then increasingly their work became fighting climate change in recent years. That's a story. Unitarian Universalism, our own tradition, has a story. Unitarianism and Universalism were both born in the early Jesus follower movements. Non-Trinitarian theologies being called Unitarian, and theologies of a loving God that never sends anyone for eternal punishment in a hell, Universalism. These were deemed heresies by Orthodox Christianity. But they made a comeback during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in Europe, eventually came to what becomes the United States, and spawned through Unitarianism transcendentalism and religious humanism. And in 1961, Unitarianism and Universalism came together and became Unitarian Universalism, which has taken on a life in many ways very different from its two parents and has become its own tradition. Every now and then it changes its own story. Most recently last year, when we adopted a new Article 2 of our national bylaws defining who we are as a people who hold the values of justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and gratitude, all centered in love. We updated our story to fit the reality we were living. Most of us in the room right now, I would venture, are here because the story told by our religion of origin, the religion we were raised in, or any other previous religion to which we might have affiliated or belonged, wasn't working for us as a story anymore. It no longer resonated with who we are and how we saw the world or ourselves. Most of us are here because we needed a new story to give meaning to our life's journey in a way that old story doesn't anymore. A story we can affirm, a story that we can see ourselves a part of, a character in, a story in which we can invest our emotions and our intellect, a story in which we can form relationships with others who share the story. Sometimes people even leave our congregation or Unitarian Universalism because the story no longer works for who they have become. Although the number of people who claim no religious affiliation continues to grow, people still look for the defining stories that religion provides to its members. Many of our contemporary fantasy and science fiction stories and franchises serve this function of a cohesive, inclusive story that binds people together. And those science fiction universes or tales or stories function as a type of scripture that encapsulates the wisdom and the traditions and the prophets of that particular story. The Lord of the Rings is but one of the most well-known. Its fans not unlike, in some ways, members of a religion. They know its texts the way adherents to certain other religions know their sacred texts. In a world that can seem out of control with capitalism and greed and pandemics and intolerance and war and bigotry and hate, the story for some people is grounding in a way the story of the Quran or the Christian scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, is grounding to people of other traditions. For example, Gollum is what happens to the soul when motivation is misplaced. Solely internalized, narcissistic, and consumptive. And when beings go that way, they become shriveled, isolated, unable to relate to others and have healthy relationships. Among the famous quotes from this body of Scripture is the wizard Gandalf replying to someone who says, "I wish that Gollum creature had been killed when they had the chance." And he says, "Many that live deserve death, but some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the wise cannot see all ends." And then later in the story, our hero Frodo is about to give up this quest to defeat the powers of darkness, right? And he tells Sam, his traveling buddy and the best friend, he can't go on anymore. And Sam says, "Well, it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come when the sun shines. It will shine out all the clearer. Those were the stories that stay with you. They meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, but they didn't, because they were holding on to something." And Frodo asks him, "What were they holding on to, Sam?" And Sam says, "That there's good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." That's a story. And you can see why the people who follow the Lord of the Rings and are so committed to it do so. It is a grounding story that's comprehensive and inclusive and empowering and inspiring. In 2 weeks, when I'm with you again, I'm going to talk about our story as a congregation and how stories we tell about our struggles guide our response to adversity, especially when that response is done not in community, but in communitas. I'll explain what that is in 2 weeks. When a community binds together with a special quest or task it has to accomplish together. Then we'll have a congregational conversation following that morning service on how we're going to respond to the days that are coming for us with this new administration and what it might mean for us and people we love, and how we might best respond as a group to take care of each other and take care of others in this community. But this morning, we're going to finish up by thinking about our own personal stories. You know, we all need this grounding story in our life. One of the reasons why I think our country is so divided politically is we no longer share a common story about who we are as this nation. And for some good reasons. I think there's a lot of us who want to be part of the story, but we want the story told as it really is, not as how we've doctored it up over all the years. And there are some people who can't get rid of that old story and can't believe it can change and don't want to edit it. Well, the story's going to change whether we want it to or not. And so we need to be actively involved in how it changes and what it goes on to become. And part of how we do that is by sharing our stories with others, sometimes sharing our story with others with whom we don't even always agree. Each of our stories, each one of us, is an amazing story, unlike any other. Your story is a great story, like the great story, like all great stories. We tend not to think of our own personal story sometimes as grand or a quest or something you can make a novel or a movie about. But it is. Each of our stories is that. An amazing tale to tell of beginnings and endings and triumphs and failures and quests and community and isolation and magic and horror and humor and wisdom and love and loss of love. Each of our lives is a hero's journey, which is a term applied to Joseph Campbell's work about the hero's quest and the hero's deed in his book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces, which he says, the adventure of the hero is a magnification of the formula represented in the rites of passage, separation, initiation, return. which might be named the nuclear unit of monomyth. That's what we saw in this morning's story. It was the instructions of how to make that story and how to learn to live into your own story. As Unitarian Universalists and as a congregation, we seek to build community, pursue personal spiritual paths, and work for justice. We come from a long history, a long story of human beings who have valued human spirituality and human intellect, sought wisdom from various and multiple sources, valued compassion and kindness, and sought human dignity and respect for everyone. Some of this history took the form of our ancestor religions, Unitarianism and Universalism. As we move into the beginning of this year, I invite you deeper into the story of Unitarian Universalism and deeper into an exploration of your own story. On the back of your order of service is a list of prompts to get you thinking about your own story. This comes from my monthly spiritual challenge. This month, my challenge to you is swap stories with someone else. In order to do this, you need to find someone to swap stories with. Now, swapping stories with your best friend or your partner isn't going to work too well because they probably know a lot of it already. And the real challenge here is to find someone else with whom you can swap stories that really doesn't know all your story yet. And yet, doing this with a perfect stranger, hi, room full of new people, may not feel safe or what you want to do either. So no one is compelled to take part in this morning, or if you want to share with somebody but don't want to share with somebody who's a complete stranger, you might feel okay sharing with me, you can come up here and share with me and we can do that together if we're all new to each other. But I want to get you started on the challenge this morning. To find somebody in the room who's willing to do it you can raise your hands. Raise your hands, find a partner, and share just a little bit of your story. You've got 5 minutes or so. And find somebody who's got their hand up, maybe stand up, partner off, share stories. You can move around the room or ask someone to come to you if your mobility is a little difficult. And if you'd rather just come talk to me, come on up here and we'll chat together.